We come now to one of the most difficult chapters in Matthew chapter 24. In chapters 24 and 25, we have the discourse that Jesus delivered on the Mount of Olives to his disciples, in which he speaks of the judgment that is to come. At this point, it has become clear that Jesus will be rejected by the Jews. He has exposed and severely denounced the hypocrisy of the Jewish establishment in chapter 23. And so now in chapters 24 and 25, Jesus turns to the future and speaks of the judgment that is to come. This is a difficult passage, as I say, especially in chapter 24. And the difficulty of it has not been relieved at all by the speculators and the radio preachers who like to come to this and see in this chapter a prediction of the second coming of Christ and the end of the world. They claim to find in this chapter signs of the near approach of the end. Every dispensationalist radio preacher will come to this passage to speak of the signs of the near approach of the end. Every date setter will make appeal to the sort of things that are described here. So I want us to try to deal with this passage according to its context and to try to determine the subject matter of it. It seems to me we can point out three especially significant points which establish the application of Matthew 24. Now, the first of these is the original context and the setting in verses 1 through 3. These first three verses make it very clear that the question that has been raised here has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. And so you would expect it to be something that would be fulfilled in the thing that happened in 70 A.D. when the Romans came against Jerusalem and destroyed the city. They took the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. The second decisive point is the time text, which comes toward the close of the passage in verse 34. Verily I say unto you, Jesus says, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. So he makes it very plain that the things he is predicting here would come to pass before that generation had passed away. The time text is against the application to the second coming of Christ. And then the third point is the Old Testament language that is used, and especially in verses 29 and following. These are the verses that the radio preachers think surely force an application of this passage to the second coming of Christ, the end of the world. But as we're going to see, the language that Jesus uses is language that was typically used frequently in the Old Testament for the fall of any great city or nation. And so it is just the application of typical Old Testament imagery to describe the fall of Jerusalem. There are a lot of books to consult that may be helpful to you in the study of Matthew 24, but I want to mention two in particular that seem to me put us on the right track. One is the book by Milton S. Terry with the title Biblical Hermeneutics. He discusses this passage in chapter 24 of Biblical Hermeneutics. And the other is the commentary of James McKnight, the old Scottish scholar who wrote commentaries on the epistles of Paul and also on the Gospels. This book that I'm referring to I have it in a 2-volume set, and it's a harmony of the Gospels. He is well worth reading, and I highly recommend this work to anyone who has access to it. James McKnight, The Harmony of the Gospels. The chapter begins in verses 1 and 2 with an announcement of the destruction of the temple. And Jesus went out from the temple and was going on his way, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. But he answered and said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Jesus had just denounced the Jerusalem establishment, the scribes and Pharisees, and their hypocrisy in chapter 23. He had spoken of how judgment was going to come upon them. He had lamented over the failure of Jerusalem to come to repentance. And then in verse 38 and 39, he had spoken of the abandonment of Jerusalem's house. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. It must have been that statement which caused the apostles or the disciples to direct his attention to the buildings of the temple as they walked by on the way out. Jesus leaves the temple here for the last time, and the house is left abandoned to its fate, left desolate, abandoned by the divine glory, as Ezekiel had described the divine glory leaving the temple in an earlier age. They direct attention to the temple, and in Mark's account, in chapter 13, verse 1, to what manner of stones and what manner of buildings were connected with the temple. In Luke's account, they direct attention to how it was adorned with goodly stones and offerings. It must have seemed just incredible to them that the house just be left desolate and that judgment should come upon it. But there is no relenting on the part of Jesus. And he says, look at all these things. There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. The temple would be completely demolished according to Jesus. And so that establishes the context of this chapter that we're going to be dealing with. It's going to deal with the destruction of the temple. We will study it carefully, and we want to pay attention as we move through to whether there is anything in it that forces us to go beyond the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem for the application. But I believe that will not be the case. Verse 3 speaks of the disciples, and as we turn to the other accounts in Mark and in Luke, we see that it is only certain of the disciples that come to him with these questions. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? When you look at these questions in Mark's account and in Luke, it is very clear that we're not dealing with a lot of different questions with different events. Some have tried to distinguish between the questions here as if they are asking on the one hand, when shall these things be that he had just predicted connected with the destruction of the temple? And then a second question, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? But when you read these questions in Mark and in Luke's account, it becomes clear that the disciples are just raising one question. At least all of these various expressions deal with the same thing. In Mark 13, verse 4, they ask him privately, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when these things are all about to be accomplished? So you see that they were thinking just of one single thing, all of them connected with the prediction that Jesus had just been making. In Luke's account, it's the same thing. In verse 7, chapter 21, verse 7, they ask him, saying, Teacher, when therefore shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass? Now, not the end of the world as something different from the destruction of the temple, but when shall these things, when the sign when these things are about to come to pass. So it all refers to one thing, and that becomes very clear from Mark and from Luke. What shall be the sign of thy coming, they ask, and of the end of the world? Now, a more literal translation of that expression is the close or the consummation of the age. I want you to listen very carefully to the definition that Vine's Expository Dictionary gives of this expression for end or close or consummation. He says it signifies a bringing to completion together, marking the completion or consummation of the various parts of a scheme. The end of the world, as a translation of this, he says, is misleading. The word does not denote a termination, but the heading up of events to the appointed climax. Aeon, the word for world, is not the world, but a period or epoch or era. It's usually explained as age. An era or a period or epoch in which events take place. The expression is used in the 9th chapter of the book of Hebrews, and in verse 26 when it says, "Once at the end of the ages Christ hath been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." The plural is used here, ages instead of age, but otherwise you have the same expression. It refers to all the preceding ages that now find their consummation as he is manifested to put away sins by the sacrifice of himself. And so that is something that comes at the close or the consummation of the ages. That's the expression that best explains what they're talking about. As R.T. France says in his commentary on Matthew, strictly this expression could refer to the conclusion of any era. It seems clear to me that the reference here is to the end of the Jewish age and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. It's difficult for me to see how the destruction of the temple that Jesus spoke of would have led them to think immediately of the end of the universe, the passing away of the world in that sense. But to think of the close of the Mosaic era and the Jewish age would be only a short step in the mental processes to go from the destruction of the temple. When that is done away, the whole system of worship is done away. And it would be an easy step to go from that to what would be then the sign of thy coming and of the close of the Mosaic age or of the Jewish age. Well, Jesus then responds to them with a warning in verses 4 and 5. "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man lead you astray. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall lead many astray." Now, we ought to take note of the practical aim. He does not give the statements that he makes about what is to happen here for speculative purpose. This is not for the radio preachers and the chart makers to draw charts and try to date the end of the world and speculate about whether the end of the world is near. It's for practical purpose. He says what he does as a warning that no man lead you astray. He says, "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall lead many astray." And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, a lot of impostors came along in the period before the destruction of Jerusalem. What the occurrences that Jesus is going to predict that will happen are not given here as signs. He tells about things that are going to happen in support of his warning about impostors who would come and try to lead people astray, and as a warning that nobody leads you astray. He goes on first to speak of political and social and physical upheavals that would affect all mankind in verses 6 and 7. "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for these things must needs come to pass, but the end is not yet." The radio preachers always point to wars and rumors of wars every time there's a new war that comes along. This is taken as a certain sign that the end is coming. Well, Jesus didn't mention these things as as signs of the near approach of the end of the world, it is to say, but the end is not yet. And he goes on in verse 7 to explain, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and earthquakes in divers places. Well, these are not signs of anything. All of these upheavals, these physical upheavals, the political and social upheavals, are things that have taken place in every age of the world. And Jesus mentions these not to say that these are signs of the near approach of anything. But the fact is, these are the kind of things that bring the false prophets out of the woodwork. And he mentions these things in order to say, don't let anybody lead you astray when they come along and making false claims in times like these. These are not signs of anything. The end is not yet. In verse 8 he says, but all these things are the beginning of travail. Now that word means the pain of childbirth. The Greek term means travail pain or birth pain. The Jews had the view that the coming of the Messiah would be preceded by these difficult circumstances, tribulation of various kinds. And Jesus is evidently referring to that sort of a thing. These bad circumstances that would precede the advent of the Messiah. This is the way Grim Thayer summarizes the Jewish view, and Arndt Gingrich's lexicon has a similar thing. If you will remember, in chapter 19 and verse 28, Jesus spoke of the regeneration or the rebirth when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, and he told the apostles, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is the turmoil that the world goes through in advance of the time when the Messianic kingdom will be finally established. And I think that there is a sense in which that happens as the Messiah comes to bring judgment upon Jerusalem with the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the kingdom is established following turmoil of the kinds that are mentioned here. Well, he goes on then in verses 9 through 12 to speak of special afflictions of disciples of Christ. Then shall they deliver you up unto tribulation, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all the nations for my name's sake. These are not just general things that would affect everybody, but this is the hatred that the disciples of Jesus would be objects of. And then shall many stumble, and shall deliver up one another, betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall lead many astray. And because iniquity shall be multiplied, the love of the many shall wax cold. The difficulty of the time would cause many people to apostatize from the faith. But verse 13 says, but he that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved. There would be salvation for those who are able to last it out through these difficult times. Then he speaks of the end once more in verse 14 and says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a testimony unto all the nations, and then shall the end come. And then shall the end come. Now, what end is he talking about? I insist again that he's talking about the end or the close of the Jewish age, and not the end of the world in the sense of the final judgment at the end of the world. The gospel would be preached in the whole world for a testimony, and then shall the end come. Well, when we turn to the epistles of Paul, we have a number of places in which there's indication that that promise had certainly been fulfilled by the time that Jerusalem was destroyed. In Romans, there's some passages that we should read, and we don't have time to put these on a reading of them on the tape, but in Romans 1, verse 8, there's a verse that we should read. Chapter 10, verse 18, and then chapter 15 and verse 19. But even more important, perhaps, even more expressive, are two verses of Colossians, one in chapter 1, verse 6, and the other in verse 23, in which it is indicated that the gospel was spread throughout the world and had been preached in all creation under heaven. Paul could say that by the time he had written the epistle to the Colossians. So we're not talking about something that it took 2,000 years to do. We're talking about something that had taken place before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so up through verse 14, it should be very clear that we are not talking about anything that has to go beyond the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple for its fulfillment. Jesus has spoken of some happenings that would occur before the time of the end of the Jewish state, and the things that he calls the beginning of travail. And now in verses 15 through 28, he speaks of the near approach of the end, the conditions that are immediately associated with the end of the Jewish system. And he speaks of great tribulation associated with the siege on Jerusalem in these verses 15 through 28. And it is very clear that he is talking about Judea, about the invasion of armies into Judea and the attack on Jerusalem in this passage. Look at the way he begins. Verse 15, he speaks of the abomination of desolation, the abomination, that the abominable thing that brings about desolation. When therefore ye see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that are in Judea flee unto the mountains, and so on. The abomination of desolation is spoken of in three places in the prophecy of Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, chapter 11, verse 31, and chapter 12, verse 11. We can't take time to try to study Daniel and to observe the context of these various passages. But what we do have time to point out is the parallel in Luke, which makes very clear what Jesus has in mind when he refers to the abomination of desolation here. In Luke's account, in chapter 21, in verse 20, instead of saying, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel the prophet, flee to the mountains, he says instead, but when ye see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that her desolation is at hand. And the very next line is the one that we also have in Matthew, saying that those that are in Judea ought to flee to the mountains. And so it seems very clear from the parallelism between these two accounts that the abomination of desolation, standing in a holy place, is the appearance of the Roman armies ready to lay siege to Jerusalem. When they appear in the land, in that holy land, then urgent action must be taken. So the parallelism shows us that we're dealing with this attack on Jerusalem. This is not a second coming of Christ passage, an end of the world passage, but it is a passage that deals with the conditions that would be there at the end of the Jewish state when the temple would be destroyed by the Romans. And this was to take place in 70 A.D. The siege started much earlier than that. I think it was 67 A.D. But the fall of Jerusalem came in 70 A.D. So that's what this is talking about. When you see those armies present in the land, then you are by all means to get away. Don't take refuge in that walled city of Jerusalem. That would be the natural thing to do. That's where people would go when there was an enemy army in the land. They would go into the city for refuge and for protection. But that city was going to fall. And so in verses 16 through 18, Jesus will say that when you see those armies in the land, then let them that are in Judea flee unto the mountains. They're to take refuge in the mountains, not in that city. Let him that is on the housetop not go down to take out the things that are in his house. He has no time even for that. No time to pack a suitcase, anything of that kind. Verse 18, And let him that is in the field not return back to take his cloak. There's no time even for that. You've got to get away just as quickly as possible. And so it seems clear that after the appearance of the Roman armies in the land, there would still be time to get away if the disciples would act in all urgency, as Jesus urges them to do here. Knight makes another point at this place. Josephus, in The Wars of the Jews, Book 2, chapters 19 and 20, shows that there was a time when the siege against Jerusalem was lifted after it had been started. It was lifted inadvisedly on the part of the Roman commander. And so there were some of the Jews that were able to get away during the time that the siege was lifted. And that may be also the time that would give opportunity for the Christian Jews who were there to get away. And that's the application that Knight makes of this situation. But the connection with the subject that we started with in verse 2, when Jesus predicted the complete demolishment of the temple, is very clear as we study the context of this passage. He goes on in verses 19 to 22 to speak of special difficulties of the times. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. How hard it would be for them to flee, as they would have to do. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter. The winter would be a time of special difficulty. Neither on a Sabbath. There's some Sabbath-keeping people today who think this is a proof text that the Christians would be keeping the Sabbath. But that's not necessarily so. The difficulty would come because the Jews would be keeping the Sabbath, and they would have these laws and rules about how far you could travel on the Sabbath day. And all of this would put up a hindrance if you had to flee on the Sabbath day. And so pray that it's not on a Sabbath. Verse 21 says, For then shall be great tribulation, such as hath not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, nor ever shall be. And in fact, Josephus, in the preface to his book on the Wars of the Jews, has described the siege on Jerusalem in just very much similar terms to this. Verse 22 goes on, And except those days had been shortened, no flesh would have been saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Out of consideration for the elect, the chosen ones of God, the chosen of God, or the Christians, the believers, out of consideration for them, the time is shortened, the days are shortened, so that the Christians may be saved. In verses 23 through 26, there's a warning against deception, because in terrible times like that, false prophets would arise, false Christ would arise, and making these claims, impostors. And so he says, verse 23, Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is the Christ, or here, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you beforehand. What's our saying? Forewarned is forearmed. He tells them in advance. There's a practical purpose in this. He tells them in advance so that they could be prepared when this comes and not be taken in by the deceivers. Verse 26, If therefore they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, go not forth. And Josephus has mentioned more than one instance in which a leader, a Messiah type figure, was in the wilderness, and people, they were trying to seduce people to go out after him in the wilderness. Somewhere out there where only a few know about it. Something of that nature. Don't go forth. Don't be deceived by that. They may say, Behold, he's in the inner chambers. Believe it not. And verse 27 says that when the Messiah comes, there'll be no mistaking it. For as the lightning cometh forth from the east, and is seen even unto the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. And so there'll be no mistaking the presence of the Son of Man when he comes. The visibility of the lightning, how it's seen from the east even into the west. That's the point of this. So there'll be no mistaking. There'll be no secret about it. He's hidden here in the inner chamber. He's out there in the wilderness. Nothing of that kind. It'll be known when he comes. And verse 28 then seems to explain and elaborate verse 27 with a proverb. Wheresoever the carcass is, the dead body, there will the eagles be gathered together. The carcass is Judaism, the city of Jerusalem. Chapter 23 has gone at length into the hypocrisy and the deadness, the spiritual deadness of Jerusalem and the refusal to repent. So it's like a dead body. And where the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. So the coming of Christ in 70 AD against Jerusalem in judgment is a matter of swooping down on this carcass, this dead body. But there will the eagles be gathered together. I believe that we also have the point here that the coming would not be a personal coming of Christ against Jerusalem, but providential through the Roman armies represented here by the eagles. There are several Old Testament passages that speak of how the enemy would come in judgment against the people of Israel at various times. As an eagle, swift as an eagle, he would come. Here, of course, the eagle is referring to the vultures who would be attracted by the dead body. But it's the Roman armies that would be attracted to this dead body, which was Jerusalem. Its deadness has been described in chapter 23. And so we learn a couple of things here in verses 27 to 28. When the Messiah comes, when he is present, there will be no mistaking it. And we see that so far as there was a coming of Jesus in 70 AD against Jerusalem, that it was a matter of coming through the armies, those that would be attracted to that dead body, which was Jerusalem, swooping down on Jerusalem in that way, bringing judgment against that city. The manifestation of the kingdom in the coming of the Son of Man is described now in verses 29 through 31. Notice first the connection between these verses, 29 to 31, with what has gone before. Those who find the end of the world in this chapter think these verses certainly prove their point when it speaks of the darkening of the sun, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling, and such things. They think these expressions certainly prove their point, that this is the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. But they have a problem here, because whatever these verses are describing, it is something that immediately follows the tribulations that have been connected with the siege of Jerusalem. Notice the way it's described. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now there is simply no doubt that verses 15 through 28 have described the tribulations that would come at the siege on Jerusalem. This is material that definitely applies to 70 AD. And verse 29 says that immediately after the tribulation of these days, these other things would follow. So that's a problem. Who use who apply these verses to the second coming of Christ, because we know that the end of the world did not come immediately after the tribulation connected with the siege of Jerusalem. And furthermore, when you come to verse 34, it points out that these things would occur within the lifetime of that generation. This generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. And so that connects the events that are being described here with the siege of Jerusalem, and at least events of that generation, the first century. I believe those who see the second coming of Christ and the end of the world in this chapter are wrong, even with respect to these verses. The thing that is really necessary to the understanding of the language that is used here in verse 29 and verse 30 is simply to understand that the Old Testament background for the imagery here, this imagery of the darkness, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving the light, the stars falling from heaven, all of this is used in the Old Testament frequently to refer to judgments that will be brought upon some city or upon some nation. Not at all referring to the end of the world, but the end of the world of a particular city or of a particular nation, and the darkness that comes upon that nation. Let me call your attention to just a few of these passages. I have several of them on the transparency, and I'll read just a few of them to show you the sort of thing that we have. In Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 10, for example, verse 9 beginning, it says, "Behold, the day of Jehovah cometh, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in its going forth, and the moon shall not cause its light to shine." Now certainly you must conclude that that refers to the end of the world, should you not? Well, most certainly it does not. When you read the heading that stands at the beginning of this chapter in verse 1, it calls this the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. And it goes on to describe the fall of Babylon. I've read the 10th verse, verses 9 and 10, in the description of this, but in a verse afterward it makes it very clear. In verse 17, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who shall not regard silver, and as for gold they shall not delight in it." And then verse 19, "Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited," and so on. So this is just a chapter that deals with the fall of Babylon and the destruction of Babylon. And yet you've got the same kind of imagery of the lights being put out, the stars of heaven, the constellations not giving light, the sun being darkened, the moon not causing its light to shine. All of this is described for that dark day of judgment that was to come upon Babylon, and with no reference at all to the end of the world. In the 34th chapter of Isaiah, and in verse 4, there's another passage that is similar. "And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heaven shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fade away, as the leaf fadeth from off the vine, and as a fading leaf from the fig tree." And so some may conclude that this certainly must refer to the end of the world. It certainly sounds like what you would expect to happen at the end of the world, but that's not the application of it at all. In the very next verse, it shows us that it is talking about the judgment that God is going to bring upon Edom and upon other nations. The whole context of this will show judgment in history, not judgment at the end of time, but judgment in history upon these various nations. Let me read one more passage. Ezekiel chapter 32. and verses 7 and 8. Now in this section of Ezekiel, he has several chapters, beginning back chapter 29, that describe the judgment that is coming upon Egypt and upon Pharaoh. And look at the description of chapter 32, verses 7 and 8. And when I shall extinguish thee, I will cover the heavens and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord Jehovah. Well, this is the same sort of language that is used in Matthew 24:29, but it's not referring to the end of time at all. It's referring to the judgment that was going to come upon Pharaoh of Egypt and upon the nation Egypt. And there are lots of other passages of this type. Read these from Joel and Amos and Zephaniah and other places. This is just a sampling of the sort of poetic imagery that is used so frequently in the prophets to refer to a dark day of judgment that comes upon a nation or upon a city. Even this expression with reference to the coming in the clouds, verse 30, they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Even that expression, or a similar parallel expression, is used in the Old Testament when it is not referring to the second coming at all. Isaiah 19 and verse 1 may be the best example. The heading given to this chapter is the burden of Egypt. But notice, behold, Jehovah rideth upon a swift cloud, and cometh into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall tremble at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Well, this is not the end of the world. It goes on to describe how this is coming about. Civil war among the Egyptians, domination by a cruel lord, verse 4. All the way through verse 4, you have the context that establishes the application of this. So, the Jehovah comes upon a swift cloud, comes into Egypt. The second coming, the end of the world, no such thing. It's God's judgment which he brings providentially upon Egypt, using civil disturbances and using a foreign nation to come and invade and bring Egypt down. This is the thing. God comes in that way, providentially, and not, there's no reference at all to the end of the world. We're going to have to continue the discussion of our passage on a new tape, so we'll go on from here on another tape.